But there was a moment, and we're going to share that here. While I was in Israel, we are driving through a tunnel on the way to Jerusalem for the first time. And of course, in a tunnel, you can't see anything but what's right in front of you, and it's just more road. And they've designed the tunnel, I know they did it on purpose, so that the left side, I think, went either a little bit further than the right side or something like that, because when it suddenly fell away, you were in full view of the city of Jerusalem spread apart. And that's when we pulled over and we read together from Psalm 122. Read this together with me. I was glad when they said to me, "Let us go to the house of the Lord. Our feet have been standing within your gates, O Jerusalem. Jerusalem, built as a city that is bound firmly together, to which the tribes go up, the tribes of the Lord, as was decreed for Israel, to give thanks to the name of the Lord. There thrones for judgment were set, the thrones of the house of David. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. May they be secure who love you. Peace be within your walls, and security within your towers. For my brothers' and companions' sake, I will say, peace be within you. For the sake of the house of the Lord our God, I will seek your good." So this morning I want to we're going to do a slideshow kind of a bit more on Tuesday night. Today I just want to kind of zoom back, and I want to take a look at, what happened to me? What did I experience internally during the trip to Israel? First of all, I'm just so grateful that I got to go. It was amazing, and on one level, it didn't, how do I say this, because it's not entirely true. It didn't teach me things I didn't know, but it exposed me to things I didn't understand. Maybe that's a good way of putting it. And I think, and this is the truth. I've tried to boil down the trip to a sentence. You try to do 9 days, full throttle running. I think we walked somewhere around 60, 70 miles. My watch didn't catch it all, but how do you boil all that down? For decades, I've studied God's Word, and I've seen the land of Israel in black and white. Kind of like the old televisions. Remember the old television with the fuzz, and you still had to hold the wires up just right, and you still don't get a quite clear picture? I can see it in living color now. And so there was something unique that happened just with that. It ignited almost everything with a little bit of understanding and clarity. So I guess I would start my observations with this. Apart from very few spots, and I mean very few spots, almost every significant point of interest in the Holy Land, even from a standpoint of this happened here, has been covered in 2 millennia of ornate construction. And so it's kind of hard to find a bare rock and say this is where Jesus taught a thing, right? Because if they can identify that this bare rock was where Jesus taught a thing, there is a chapel built up over it. And it's just the way the thing is. And honestly, that's exactly what we would do. We would do it too. And so, it's just, you've got 2,000 years worth of history on top of every square inch of Israel. And so I had to get used to that. That took me aback a little bit, because I'm kind of a plain guy, This is as much decoration as I can handle, right? This is like the full extent. Now if you add like 47 layers of gold and silver and jewels and you drip it all over the place, it's just more than my brain can do, right? I'm just not wired that way. So I had to get used to that. But let's just do a little bit of a history lesson. And let's just go back to the beginning for a moment. God promised Abraham the land of Canaan. You get up, go where I'll show you, and when you get there, I'll tell you. And so Abraham ends up in Canaan, and God promises him this is going to be the land. Centuries later, the descendants of Abraham, 12 tribes of Israel, claimed the land under Joshua's leadership. And following the one true God, however, in the midst of a pagan society that worships a whole pantheon of gods, it's very hard to isolate yourself from community and from society and to be different. And we know that. We know that it's hard to be different from the rest of society, because we might live around people who aren't necessarily worshiping other deities, but they're worshiping themselves, and it's hard to pull yourself out of that surrounding atmosphere and to be isolated and to be different. But we are always supposed to be like the salmon, swimming upstream while everybody else is going downhill. That's just the way it's always been. So following the one true God in the midst of a pagan society was hard, and they gave in. And they would follow every other idol they could basically get their hands on. And, eventually, God said, if you keep it up, I'm going to deport you, and deport you he did. The Assyrians came in, leveled the first 10 tribes of Israel, and the Babylonians came in, kicked Assyria's can, and then moved down and took the southern 2 tribes of Judah. And after 70 years of captivity, the Medo-Persian king, who had come in and kicked Babylon's can, decided that Israel could go back and they could rebuild the temple. And so they rebuild the temple under Ezra and Haggai. They rebuild the city walls under Nehemiah. And that begins what's called the Second Temple period. First temple, Solomon, it's gone. Second temple, Ezra and Nehemiah. And, well, it just wasn't quite good enough. If you continue following history a little bit, we started out with Israel being conquered by Assyria, Babylon conquering Assyria, the Medo-Persians conquering Babylon, and eventually Greece. Remember, this guy named Alexander the Great came along and he conquered Medo-Persia. And then right after that, somewhere around 60 BC, a little earlier, Rome came and conquered Greece. So you've got this march of empires. Rome became kind of the global superpower of their time, 60 BC through to about 300-400 AD. So it was a long run, but it was eventually also doomed to failure. But it was Rome that was in power over the nation of Israel and over most of the known world at that point in time when Jesus walked the earth. Now, that second temple was nice. It was built on top of the hill where it had always been. But King Herod, who had lots of money because he was taxing everybody, but had no responsibilities to build an army, he had lots of money then to devote to building things, and build things he did. That's why he's called Herod the Great, not because he was an awesome guy, but because he built things, and he built significant things. And one of those was he took a look at the temple as it had been built on top of the hill, and he said, not big enough. So with, I think, permissions, he kind of removed that temple in part, and he scraped off the top of that hill, turned it into a plateau, and then built out the top of that hill into this large arena that we now recognize as the Temple Mount. And he surrounded it with a wall, it's called a Milo, that holds up this man-made plateau, built the second temple right back on top of that, far more glamorous and glorious than it was. And it's still the second temple. And that is the temple that Jesus walked around with. That's the one he saw when he crested the hills, as he was reciting Psalm 122, one of the songs of ascent. And as they would recite those songs and crest the hill and look over, they would see this massive, beautiful, golden-topped temple that's now gone. But there's reasons for that. Jesus lived and he walked in Israel and he walked in Jerusalem during that second temple period. He walked in the courtyard of that second temple period. I was able to walk in that courtyard, but the temple is gone. And the reason the temple is gone, well, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Let's go back to the time of Jesus. We know the story. His mother was living in Nazareth, and an angel came to her and said, hey, guess what, Mary? You've been blessed with grace. God is going to let you bear his son. And she said, you know what? May it be to me as the Lord has decreed. She surrendered herself to that. And she bore the Messiah, not in Nazareth, but in Bethlehem, because her fiancé was of the line of David. Jesus was born in Bethlehem. He was announced in Nazareth, born in Bethlehem, and pretty soon, they had to boogie out of town and go down to Egypt. When they left Egypt, they came back up north, and instead of stopping in the area of Bethlehem, which would have been kind of common sense, but because Herod's son had taken over the rule of that area and they were afraid that he might want to kill Jesus too, they just went on up to Nazareth and they camped there. It's not too long after that, about 30 years, but it's not too long after that, Jesus leaves Nazareth as his main dwelling place. We'll get to that, maybe. He leaves Nazareth as his main dwelling place, moves to Capernaum, which is right nearby. I had no idea how close by it was, but it's like you can see it from here, kind of thing. And he moves to Capernaum, and he sets up his base of ministry there. He never went more than 25 square miles. We're going to come back to that. But the entirety of Jesus' primary ministry was in a 25 square mile block. Triangle, actually. Very small. Very small. Well, we know the story. Jesus was born in Bethlehem, lived in Nazareth, died in Jerusalem, buried in a nearby tomb, but 3 days later said, not going to happen. He rose up out of that tomb, conquered the grave, beating the supernatural powers of the world, taught his disciples for another 40 days. Then he climbed up on the Mount of Olives, which is right there in Jerusalem. It's just right there. I'm overwhelmed at how close everything is as I walk around the land. And then he ascended back to sit at the right hand of the Father, and he is awaiting today the command to return. 10 days after the ascension, the disciples were in the upper room praying. The Holy Spirit falls in power. They go out and they speak in the language of all of the nations that had gathered in Jerusalem and proclaim the glories of the Lord, and the gospel begins to spread like a wildfire. Now, initially, Christianity was considered to be just an extension, an offshoot, or a sect of Judaism. And because Judaism had kind of been accepted by the Roman government as, yeah, you go ahead, you can do that, Christianity kind of flew under the radar for a little while, until it didn't. And then persecution begins to break out upon Christianity because it was clearly different, or clearly an extension, forcing the Christians to get up and leave town. And guess what happened? Everywhere the Christians went, they shared people the good news about Jesus. And so the church began to spread all over the empire. About 30 years after Christ, in the year 66 AD, the Jews rebelled against Rome, and Rome brought down the hammer. They sent in the Roman general Titus, and he laid siege to Jerusalem. And after a period of time, a couple of years, he decided to light the city on fire. One of the things that's really cool is that most of Jerusalem was made of limestone. Now, I don't know if you know this, but limestone is easy to saturate. Water that pours from the rain onto limestone can saturate it. And when you light fire to something that's made of limestone or encased in limestone, all that fire heats up that water. What happens to water when it gets hot? It turns to steam. What happens to steam when it's encased in something? It blows up. And the rocks of Israel and Jerusalem blew up all over the place. And that's one of the ways that Rome destroyed the city of Jerusalem. And in AD 70, the Roman general Titus broke through the walls of Jerusalem, set it on fire, massacred its residents, and completely destroyed the temple. Not one stone, as Jesus had said, was left on top of another. Pretty much the only thing left was a retaining wall to that great big platform that I spoke about. Particularly the west side was left intact. And that is what you see on the news, the Western Wall, or the Wailing Wall. They call it the Wailing Wall because the rumor is that when the city was destroyed, even the stones wept. Well, that wasn't necessarily the complete end of Israel just yet. About 967 zealous Jews left Jerusalem, left most of Israel, of that region, and they ran off into the desert area by the Dead Sea. And there, King Herod the Great had built a massive winter temple. It's a winter temple because it was the desert, you see. During the winter, when we were there, it was 100 degrees. During the winter. During the summer, it's about 130 degrees. Yeah, it's hot. It was nice, it was cozy, it was warm, it was robust. But on top of a hill, he scraped off the top. He had a lot of scraping to do, King Herod the Great, but he had a lot of money, so he could do it. And he built a massive fortress called Masada. These 967 zealous Jews fled Jerusalem, went to Masada, and the Roman general said, I'll get them, it'll take me 3 days. For 4 years, they held off the Roman army. Just 1,000. And a lot of them were women and children. Because it was a massive fortress that was filled with water, and it was filled with food. And so they had everything they needed. Well, at the end of 4 years, the Roman general who was in charge of conquering Masada decided to do the same thing that Titus had done. He set Masada on fire, also made of limestone. You know what happened next. The rocks began exploding, and the fortress began to fall. Well, the Jews inside decided to draw lots, and archaeologists found the lots, the little shards of pots that had broken, and they all wrote their names on them. And they drew those lots for 10 names. Those 10 names were chosen men to slay all of the rest. Those 10 men drew 3 names. Those 3 names were meant to slay the other 7. They drew 1 name, and that last name was to slay the other 2 before committing suicide. The plan almost worked. In the morning, when the Roman general came and he walked into Masada, he found a horror show. 962 bodies. 2 women and 3 children had somehow survived the slaughter, wounded but not dead. And it just so happens that one of the names you may or may not have heard, Josephus, who has written a history of Israel, he wrote for us the details of Masada because it turns out he ended up marrying one of those women. And she finally told him the story, where for decades nobody had known what had happened inside Masada. That, about the year 74 AD, the fall of Masada was the end of Israel. Until recently, 1940s. Rome continued to persecute Jews and Christians until the Roman Emperor Constantine rose to power. There's a big story there, I can skip that. But in the year 312 AD, so we've gone a couple of years, in the year 312 AD, he made Christianity legal, and everything changes. At that moment in time, when he made Christianity legal, he became a Christian in 306, I believe. And in 306, he also attained the emperorship. Yeah, let's go with that. He became emperor. And in 312, he made Christianity legal. His mother, Helena, was a low-born Christian. She was poverty-stricken until that moment. But he sent her, or she took herself, it's a little unclear. In the year 326, she made a journey, a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And there, she and her troops began to look for key locations in Israel. And almost immediately, the early church, that's the Byzantine era church, the Byzantine church in the 300s, almost immediately built 4 major cathedrals. So we're going to talk about a couple of those. First one is the Church of the Annunciation. The Church of the Annunciation, as you can understand, that's where the birth of Jesus was announced. And it happens to be in what town? Nazareth. In Nazareth, they built the Church of the Annunciation. Gabriel comes to Mary, and I think I've got another slide there with a picture. Gabriel comes to Mary, and there's the picture, the little painting on the right-hand side of the screen. Gabriel comes to Mary and says, hey, you've been richly blessed by God. God has given you all kinds of grace, and how'd you like to have a baby? And Mary says, let it be to me as the Lord has decreed. According to tradition, that's her home. The Church of the Annunciation is built up over this grotto where that house is. And it's got a steel, my hand is sticking through the fence taking that picture. There's a steel fence there so that, the endless stream of pilgrims can't walk all over it. But that is the Basilica of the Annunciation. And if you look up, as great cathedrals do, they draw your eyes upward. And the shape of the top of the building is in the shape of an upturned lily. And that's the floral representation of Mary, who bowed her head in acquiescence to the Lord's request. So it's a beautiful church. We got to see that. And there's been some other things found relatively close by to that just kind of further corroborates the story. There's a home that was discovered, I want to say in the last 100 years archaeologically, right next door to the church, and the walls of it are inscribed with the names of, not because Mary wrote it, but it's inscribed with the names of Mary and Joseph and Jesus. This was apparently a Christian family that had lived there in latter years. So kind of a neat archaeological find. And archaeology is happening all over. Sometimes with shovels, and sometimes with brushes, and sometimes with backhoes. I mean, I think I saw it all. The next thing they did is the Byzantine church, Helen, and they went to Bethlehem. And they built there the Church of the Nativity. And I think I've got another graphic or two up there, I'm not sure. There we go. Look how ornate that is. Now, I don't know if you can really see it on the screen or not, but underneath that red frame, there's a hole in the ground where you can look through and you can see the rocks down below. And that is supposedly the location where Mary gave birth. Directly across the room, I mean, we're talking 3 feet, directly across the room, whoever taking that picture is standing on it, is a stone, well, it's completely encased. I think I might have another picture. It's a stone encased manger that's now filled with a wire blockaded set of candles. So that's supposedly the manger where Jesus was laid. And you can just see how everything is gilded. Everything is covered. Everything has 2,000 years of history on top of it. Helen and the rest of the soldiers that she had with her, the party, they went off to find another church, and this time they went looking for the location of the crucifixion. And they think they found it. And they also went looking for, well, if the crucifixion is here, the tomb's got to be nearby. And lo and behold, they did find an empty tomb very nearby. And they found right next to it an additional tomb. We'll talk about that here in just a moment. And so they decided to build a huge cathedral. Roughly, if my understanding is correct, roughly the size of a city block. Massive, massive cathedral. And it's no longer that large. The cathedral that's there today has been torn down, rebuilt, torn down, rebuilt, torn down, rebuilt. And it's now about 1/3 the original size. It's still massive, I tell you. It's still massive. But there at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, that's the name of tomb, the sepulchre, they built this massive church. And inside of the church is the hill where Jesus was crucified. Inside the church is the second tomb that they discovered. Inside the church is both tombs, as a matter of fact. And you can walk around and you can see them. Now, that's not a very good picture because I'm not a very good picture taker, but that is the location where Christ was crucified. And I think the next picture will show you that's called the Edicule, little house. There's literally a marble house built around the empty tomb of Christ. And it's inside the cathedral. And it's huge. But it's called the little house. And so you can see all of those people gathered around it. I was probably in one of those pictures. You get in this big long line along with thousands of other Christians trying to see. And you go inside. You're allowed 2 or 3 at a time to go into the Edicule and then to walk down into the area. And they've got a priest and a nun that are there keeping you from bonking your head, which was good because I almost did. And you walk in there and you can see, encased in marble, because everything is encased in marble, the stone platform where Jesus was laid. Now, how do I know it's encased in marble? Because they also very helpfully cut a hole in that marble and put a 3-inch thick piece of glass in it so that you could see the stone that is beneath it where Jesus was laid. But everything is encased in marble. And so as I walked into that particular tomb, I dropped immediately to my knees. It was almost impossible not to. And to recognize that this is where Jesus was laid after his crucifixion. And once again, I confessed Christ, and once again, I yielded my faith in him. Now, there actually happens to be 2 sets of tombs, and maybe there's another slide up there or not. We'll see. That's the inside. That's the platform where Jesus was laid. Let's hit the next screen there. This is the second tomb that's right next door. And the church tradition, it's not written in the scriptures, but the church tradition was that after Joseph of Arimathea, he's a wealthy guy, had donated his tomb to Jesus, and Jesus had been raised again, he decided not to reuse that tomb. And so he went and had another one built, and this is called the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, or Arimathea. And if you go down in there, and I don't think I have another picture of it on there, but if you go down in there, there's 2 cutouts for 2 bodies, Mr. and Mrs. Joseph of Arimathea. And then there's another site that's also today is called the Tomb of Jesus. It's the Garden Tomb, and I think I may have a graphic of it up there. In 1867, that's relatively recent. In 1867, a Protestant, not a Catholic, who decided that he didn't really think the Edicule and all of that was where Jesus was buried. He went out prospecting, as it was, around Jerusalem, and he found another empty tomb. I do think, after looking at the evidence, I'm convinced that the tomb that is inside that church, covered by the Edicule, covered by marble, that's probably the location where Jesus was buried for short term. But this tomb looks a whole lot more like my imagination does of what the tomb of Jesus was. And remember, it wasn't always inside of a building. It was probably just exactly like that. And looking inside, you can see there's an iron fence that's been put so that every Christian in the world can't walk up and touch the walls and erase a painting, actually, that was painted there. And I think maybe the next screen shows that. Yeah, that would be the bench or the place where the bodies would be laid. And just above that is a cross. And the letters in the top quadrants of the cross are the initials for Jesus Christ, is the Alpha and the Omega. Jesus Christ is God. It's this declaration there. And so perhaps the garden tomb is the original tomb of Jesus. I think the evidence is on the first one. But that one felt more appropriate to my heart. I'm just gonna say that. I was struck by its simplicity, but when I went into the other one, I was struck. So those are the first three churches the Byzantine church built immediately after Christianity was legalized. And the last one was, we think about the events of Jesus' life, the Annunciation, the Nativity, the crucifixion and resurrection. Well, if you were going to build a church, what would be the fourth church you might build? How about the Church of the Ascension? It's the next major point where Jesus was located geographically. On the Mount of Olives, which is just right across the way. Excuse me, cough drop. On the Mount of Olives, the Byzantine church built what is today called the Church of the Ascension, or the Dome of the Ascension. I think I've got a picture of that. There it is. It's not very glamorous. The wall surrounding it are the walls of the original church. But remember, marauding armies do what marauding armies do, and they tear things up. An interesting thing to note on that Dome of the Ascension, that dome wasn't always there. When it was originally built, it was built as a hollow tube. Because remember what the angels told the apostles. Hey guys, why are you standing here? Acts chapter 1. Why are you still standing here? The same Jesus that you just saw leave, he's coming back in the same way. The Bible tells us he's going to place his feet on the Mount of Olives. Right? So he's going to come back to the same spot. So they didn't have a roof originally. Well, now they've got a roof. I have to cut that, I'm sorry. In matter of fact, inside, one of the few spots that everything isn't encased in marble, but it is framed in marble. Take a look at the next slide. That is the rock that is at the very tippy top. It's the highest possible elevation on the Mount of Olives. So if you were Jesus and you were going to leave the earth, you'd go to the highest spot, right? That's the manufactured idea. And there I am, touching the highest rock on the Mount of Olives. Yep, that's my ugly fingers. Just what it is. So those churches aren't alone. I mean, those are the first four that the Byzantine church built. And we got to see each one of those and to discuss the history of it and to see how things went. But, pardon me, the march of time doesn't end. Immediately after the legalization of Christianity, the Byzantine church used its freedom and money to build churches. The Church of the Annunciation, Nativity, Sepulchre, and the Ascension. They also built churches everywhere else. Mount Tabor is frequently considered to be the place of the transfiguration of Jesus. So you climb up Mount Tabor, and it is a climb. I'm just going to tell you. If you're in Israel, you can skip leg day, because every day is leg day. Everything is uphill. Even the downhill is uphill. I'm not sure how, but everything is uphill. So we climbed up Mount Tabor. And remember the scene of the transfiguration. Jesus is transfigured in front of Peter, James, and John, the inner circle. And there, they see Moses and Elijah talking to Jesus. Now, Peter's a little sleepy and a little dopey. So he says, hey, I got an idea. Let's build 3 tabernacles. And Jesus basically says, no, we're not going to do that. So what do you think they did? They built 3 chapels. Why should we listen to Jesus? We're just going to do what we want, right? So they built 3 chapels. Actually, it's one big building with 3 chapels in it. The great big glorious ones for Jesus, 2 little tiny ones for Moses and Elijah. So I'll bring some more of these Tuesday night with more cough drops and more water. But I got to tell you, the trip through Jerusalem was absolutely astounding. The trip through Israel. And the most awe-inspiring thing of the entire trip, for me, was how small and close together everything was. You could stay in Cana of Galilee and you could see Nazareth. You could be on a boat, which I got to do, on the Sea of Galilee, and you could see the entire circumference of Jesus' primary earthly ministry. Everything was right there. Everything took place in a small section. It made me think this. We might think sometimes that our ministry is too small. Oh, bless your heart. We might think sometimes that our ministry is too small, but the reality is God has put you exactly where He's put you because He can change the world through you. He can use a Galilean fisherman. I think He can use a Paris native or a Paris transplant. Let's close with prayer. Trent, can I ask you to guide us through communion? I don't know if I've got enough voice to do that, but let's pray.